Normally, I wouldn't record this downstairs in my bed. Normally, I wouldn't be recording this on my phone. But I am attempting to be nice to my roommate for homework purposes. So, I want to start out special thanks to Discord user Average Human for clarifying a few things on their research, which helped me realize things with mine. And second, special thanks to Gian Onesto for the creation of Jumbie, because your game is a case study that I reviewed about 8 years ago, but I haven't revisited. So, this is going to be a long one. I'm going to talk about king safety, I'm going to talk about trading of minor pieces, and then, at the end, we're going to get somewhere. So, let's start with king safety. Now, king safety is a relatively simple formula to understand if you always start at a baseline. So, let's say the baseline is a king in normal chess. You can increase the king safety of both sides by adding an entire extra pawn line. I don't know why you would, but you can. You can add 8 pawns to the game. And that would naturally make the game slower, so it would take longer for either player to mate, and it would take longer for either player to eventually get a pawn promotion, which can swing the tide of the game. Those are the two ways to really win with perfect play. Mate the king because they can't help it, or, get into an end game and be the first one to promote in a meaningful way and win the end game, right? That pushes it off. Another easy example is if you added, 8 ranks in the middle of the board. So suddenly it's 8 by 16 with the armies in the same place. This slows down the game and increases king safety. The other way is if you replaced every piece in the army. No, let's just replace the queen with an Amazon, which moves and captures as both a queen and knight. This would make king safety go down and speed up the game. You see this in games like Saruman's chess and Gothic chess, where because you add more attacking material, you weaken the enemy king safety. Okay, now all games are designed around certain king safeties and king layouts. The most common one is the one that descends from Shatranj, Chaturanga, etc., where the king moves one square orthogonally or diagonally. However, there are other paradigms of this and other ways to balance it. For example, a hex king only moves to 6 squares, not 8. A Shang-Chi king only moves to 4 squares and cannot leave a 3x3 area, etc. Now, there are some which are roughly equivalent, where the king moves as a knight that's about the same strength as a king that moves 1 square orthogonally or diagonally. It's just as easy to mate, and it actually creates pretty interesting games. However, it is wrong to assume that two king safeties which are close enough to be on the same board. You have to heavily test it. Now, originally in Shang-Chi, we were solving this issue by just buffing the king. We buffed the king until it was a roughly equivalent piece in king safety to the normal king, based on its own movements. And then we tried to build the army around it so that its offenses and defenses counteracted the chess army's offenses and defenses. But reanalyzing and readdressing the game, we decided that we were not going to buff the king. But I hadn't looked at this case study that I did on Jambi, DJAMBI, for 8 years until today. And I had been reminded of this and been getting a feeling about it, and then I really looked at it again. And in Jambi, the king piece, the piece you have to checkmate or capture, moves and captures as a queen. And it's balanced around that. So basically everything in the game moves and captures as a queen, And there's a bunch of pieces called corpses that eventually scatter the board that the king mover can't capture and can't move through. So they get more and more constrained as the game goes on, and it's all about corpse manipulation to lock that strong piece in a small enough area and then hit it with like two queens and kill it. And then there's a piece called the reporter, which can much more heavily zone it out in a tight space to kill it, and all kinds of stuff like that, right? Now, that said, those pieces that it uses are a little too strong to appear in a chess game that has a normal king. And the same is true of Shang-Chi if we're keeping the king the same. My glasses keep falling off for some reason. Forgive me. Okay, that's better. In Shang-Chi, they have no diagonal defenses, but they have more orthogonal defenses than a normal king because they have an entire king nexus, or pieces dedicated only to king safety, which are the advisors and elephants, which protect those lines. And this allows them to have something that normally would be devastating to king safety, the cannon, in the game, but it also means they don't have bishops or anything else that attacks diagonally, really, that isn't blockable physically. So, when you introduce them to a game with bishops, with the normal king safety and king movement, you end up back in this situation that we had been running in circles around for literal years. The queen and the bishops hurt. We have blanket fixed that, like soft fixed it, by re-increasing king safety in our current Shang-Chi version, which has Guardian Lions there. But it would be just as, if not more effective, to remove the bishop lines entirely, because the rest of the camp structure, the rest of the army layout, is also not balanced to fight bishops. And Shang-Chi game feel has lots of infiltration and trading, and that's just not possible with bishop lines. Bishop lines force you to have to address things that you normally wouldn't. Okay, that's one half. This is why Couch Tomatoes 4 wins rule works really well, because I've been trying to figure it out. Next half. Now, my thanks to Jean Ernesto over, let's talk about Discord user Average Humor's observations about Mad Chess. Now, in Mad Chess, they currently have an issue which may sound very familiar to anyone who has playtested our army before, where any of their knight or bishop type pieces that are worth at least 2/3 of a pawn more than the normal knight and bishop struggle to develop against the weaker knights and bishops. Now, that is because while they are facing the same squares, this knight, the strong one, cannot move to those without losing a trade, and 2/3 of a pawn is above the typical turn of tempo type deal. What Beza called I believe, the quantum of effect or something. But that 1/3 to 1/2 of a pawn range is about how much a turn is worth in chess. And any difference in piece value that is less than that value of tempo, is almost negligible. It means that you can treat them as roughly the same, because if you can make a move better than the lost amount with that tempo, then you haven't actually lost material. You haven't actually put yourself in a worse scenario. This lets you trade knights and bishops despite the difference in strength, and sometimes even lets you ignore the bishop pair bonus. And, these types of things, that amount of value is also what you gain by undoubling pawns or undoing edge pawns, right? Now, we also see this in a more extreme case in shogi. In shogi, A single turn of tempo can be worth as much as 2 shogi pawns. That means that anything worth less than that, which is, the lance, the knight, and um, the shogi pawn, ends up being roughly equivalent in strength, at least as far as trades and getting things in hand and using things for attack, that type of deal, which sounds super familiar to anyone who's played shogi. And they just blame it, oh, it's because of drops. Yeah, it's because of drops, but it's also because drops have caused turns of tempo to be worth massive amounts in your game. And same goes for the silver and gold general, but they would be close enough to feel this effect even in normal chess. Uh, and then we have the leveling of the bishop and rook, which I'm not going to get into now because it's a slightly more complicated topic that is more caused by the geometry of drop variance than it is by anything else. Okay. Now, this effect that I said sounds familiar to anyone who's playtested our army is that things that have more of a value discrepancy than that, but are still close, that, 1/3, 2/3 of a pawn, cause the stronger piece to not be able to develop and the trades to not happen. The player with the stronger piece can avoid the trade, but it slows down the game and slows down trading in general because they're not willing to part with something an obvious advantage they need to win. And if they do make the trade, they've made a mistake and put themselves in a disadvantageous position, assuming the two armies are already equally matched. So they don't trade. And if they don't trade, oftentimes the game doesn't progress, especially if there's a pawn structure involved. So his identification of this quote-unquote problem in Mad Chess is exactly the problem we are feeling with the horse versus the knight and the horse versus the bishop in our Shang-Chi versus chess matchup, because knights and bishops are worth 3.15 and 3.3 pawns respectively, just about. That is an estimation based off of my decent memory of stockfish evaluations of those pieces. And the horse is 2.5 because it's half a rook. About. And that difference is roughly in that 2/3 of a pawn range. And the horse is able to do the same thing that a normal knight is able to do in Mad Chess. It's able to harass and zone out the piece that is technically stronger than it and force the game not to progress until the weaker one, the horse in this case, is dislodged or a massive break happens in the pawn structure. But 4 wins already fixes that issue for the bishop, and laming would fix that issue for the knight. So there you go. That was my deep dive look and comparison at other variants. For the record, laming is when Shang-Chi pieces force the jumping piece, the knight, to be blocked. Despite the fact that it isn't a horse. It is treated like a horse by Shang-Chi pieces, effectively. Let's just talk about that one matchup for now. Excuse me. Alright. So what does this mean? Well, this explains why laming feels so fucking good, despite the fact that the reason Tomato came up with laming isn't the actual reason it was needed or could be needed. The reason Couch Tomato came up with laming was because of a perceived issue with knights being able to too easily attack the enemy king. But the truth is, because you're able to zone them out so easily with proper play, assuming that your defenses don't allow something else to go rampaging through your space, queen, the knight is fine. It is able to jump in and out of the territory, sure, and it's able to get to squares that it wants to be more easily than the horse, sure, but it doesn't actually cause a fundamental king safety issue. You just protect the square that the knight needs to get to, and you can do that with placing an elephant in the middle to zone it out on the third rank, and moving the rook forward one square to zone it out on the second rank, or even just developing the horse. Either the elephant or the horse will let the cannon cover the advanced squares, and the rook cover the other ones. And then if you're in a situation that you're being chased down by the knight, typically it's because it got past your horse and your pawn line and other things already. So you're in a bad position there already. So the knight doesn't need to be nerfed because of king safety issues. It's just nice to nerf it a little bit so that the piece value actually matches the horse more closely, and they're close enough that you can consider trading them and the game can actually progress without having this positional slugfest slog of tactics. Which, maybe there is a place for that, but it definitely doesn't feel like Shang-Chi, and it doesn't feel good to most of the players who are playing it that we've tested so far. Certainly I enjoyed it, but I realized after speaking to people I was the exception, and I didn't even always enjoy it. I just enjoyed it sometimes in certain positions. It was really interesting for me to try to jostle around like, oh, we can't trade, oh, we can't trade here, oh, we can't trade here, but I'll make a development over here and a development over here and a development over here, and they're making developments too, and then we end up in a little fight and a skirmish, and something happens and the board's changed, and then we keep doing it, right? And there might be a place for that, but it isn't the intended game feel of this army. So I don't know if laming is the correct solution to that problem, but it is a solution that works. As is 4 wins for the bishop. If you nerf them, you kind of let them trade. The same could be done, by the way, by buffing the horse. You also wouldn't have this issue as if it was able to capture one square orthogonally, because then it would be within the margin. Move and capture one the square orthogonally. I think it's technically slightly stronger than the knight and bishop. Closer to the bishop, of course. But you see the point, right? If the two pieces are relatively close in value, you don't have this issue. That's why we had this issue much less in Western Dynasty, as one more example, because the elephant in that army was both the Shang-Chi and Zhengyi elephant, which is about 3 points in value. And because of that, it traded really well with the bishops and knights. And because of that, the game progressed. Anyways, if you feel like I was rambling, yeah, probably. But I needed to talk about this because, dear Lord, did I do a lot of research today in between doing homework. And I didn't even mean to. I just started getting obsessed, which happens sometimes, which is probably why I've made so much progress on this. All right, Roland out. Be kind to each other.